Our next case we're looking at is South Africa. And I really like how this chapter starts off with just something very simple, a very simple idea. In South Africa, race, language, ethnicity were and are all powerful predictors of media consumption. This is an interesting concept that we haven't yet really talked about. How is it that your race or your ethnicity in a country could directly affect which media you consume? Why would that be possible? Well, in this context, in this country, it's for a very specific reason. And it's because of something called apartheid. Apartheid was legalized, institutionalized racism and segregation in South Africa from 1948 until the early 1990s. Right? In this institutionalized form of racism, the minority Afrikaners ruled the entire country. And the vast majority black Africans had no rights. And everything was completely separate. So this went on until 1994 and really ended with the election of President Nelson Mandela. Now think about that, 1994. Today's 2020. For 26 years, the country has been free and independent. The majority of its population have only been free for 26 years. That's extremely unique to anything we've seen before. And it's very important we remember this. We've talked about time as a variable. Well, this is a very new country. And it's in this time period, these past 26 years, with this context of race and ethnicity and language being so important, that we start our story about South Africa. So we start off our discussion talking about media structure. And we're going to get to newspaper circulation very quickly. But so in 1990, starting with 1994, we start to see the development of the first legal black press in South African history. Now we're going to put a little asterisk next to that, because at this point, it's extremely relevant that we mentioned, at this point in time, most of that black media were still owned by Afrikaners, the white South African minority. Now why would that be? Pretty simply because whenever you have half a century worth of discrimination and racism, that bleeds over into socioeconomic terms. It means the majority of the money was centered in the Afrikaners' hands. So even after independence came and we started to see the development of a black South African press, it was still initially controlled by white South Africans because they still controlled most of the economy. They had most of the money. Right? But another thing we also need to talk about when we discuss the media structure inside of South Africa is that of language. This is also a variable that we haven't talked about in our cases yet. And why is language important in South Africa? South Africa has 11 official languages. That's a big deal. It says something pretty strong as a statement coming from government to identify 11 different languages and make them all official. It speaks to the diversity within the country. Right? And then you automatically have to think, well, if you have 11 official languages, and realistically you have more linguistic groups than that in South Africa, but can media cover 11 different language groups all the same? Short answer is no. No, they cannot. That is a lot of time and money for any media organization to try and cover that whole spectrum. So right there, you're starting to get an idea that probably some of these groups are going to be more important or get more attention in media structure than other groups. Right? And another big thing, the media structure, also based off of differences in languages. At the time of this textbook, 78% of the population watched TV. That meant as a dominant medium. But surprisingly, or strikingly rather, 92% of the population listened to radio. It means at that point, radio was the dominant medium in the country to consume news by. Now, South Africa, up until recently, South Africa had the largest economy of any African country. Right now it's Nigeria, but before it was South Africa. Even in that point in time, though, you take to account the richest country in Africa, more people listen to radio than TV. Perhaps linguistics had something to do with it. Perhaps certain groups didn't have television stations in their language, but they have language-based radio, local radio. Therefore, more and more people consumed that radio, that medium. All right, and we're going to see around the world, radio is still a lot more important than most people tend to think. All right, so in general though, if we go by our models and try to apply our Western models to South Africa and we talk about media structure, we look at newspaper circulations. And the author tells us very quickly, newspaper circulations are extremely low in South Africa, minus certain urban centers. But even there, newspaper circulation isn't that great. And the author very quickly says, language is a huge part of it. You have so many different people who read different languages, it makes sense that they turn to a different medium other than newspaper. But we're going to see how else language affects our different variables in the models and see if we can try to make these different models fit into South Africa. Alright, so our next variable, political parallelism. Let's remember that political parallelism is a measure of how much influence political parties have into media organizations. Low, medium, or high. Well, in South Africa, we find a system that's quite unique. We tend to call South Africa a one-party dominant democracy, meaning although they have multiple different political parties, one party wins every single time, and that's the ANC, African National Congress. Now, why do they continually win? Since 1994, they've won the presidency every single year. Why do they win every single year? Well, they're the party of Nelson Mandela. They're the party of freedom, of independence, of anti-apartheid. And remember, this is only 26 years they've been independent. So this party is still very, very popular. And many people in South Africa still remember the time of apartheid. And the ANC helped lead them out of that era. So it's not surprising that you end up with the ANC winning time after time after time again. But how does that affect us in political parallelism in the media system as a whole? Well, in general, there is no party press, okay? However, media do cover the ANC almost exclusively. But why would they? Why is that the case? Well, generally speaking, in all countries around the world, media cover the governing party. And it just so happens in this case, the governing party, the ANC, has always been the governing party. So ANC dominates news coverage. Now, while the party itself may not influence media organizations to make them cover them, the outcome of being biased towards heavy coverage of the ANC is still the same. So the author argues here, political parallelism as a variable has to be high because that outcome is the same. But the difference that you don't get in these models, you don't see from these models, is the why political parallelism is high. You would have no way of knowing that South Africa is a one-party dominant democracy, for instance. You would just think that political parties influence media a lot. And the author says, you would be wrong to make that statement. Now we're looking at journalistic professionalism in the country. And the author is pretty blatantly honest with us. He says there are pockets of journalistic professionalism. But overall, you would probably still argue that professionalism is low in the country. But he said, once again, this would be a false narrative. The fact that in some places journalistic professionalism are really high and some are really low, you can't just add those values together and divide them and get an average and have a good idea of what's actually going on in South Africa. He says instead what you need to do is look at where is journalistic professionalism high, look at where journalistic professionalism is low, and explain why that is the case. And once again, very quickly, language becomes a prominent reason for it. Linguistics. So some of your biggest skill shortages are in rural areas and in smaller linguistic groups. What does this mean? It means your urban areas, your cities with larger populations, this tends to be where your best journalists are. It also tends to be where your larger linguistic groups are. Rural areas tend to be more where your smaller linguistics are, or smaller linguistic groups are. So how do these things matter? Well, you can have a smaller linguistic group in a community, and people in that group want to be journalists. However, you have such a small consumer group in your language. When a media corporation is thinking about broadcasting in your language, remember, companies, we've talked about this, media companies, part of the company idea is making a profit. If you are in a smaller linguistic group, that means your consumer base is smaller. So a media organization might not offer journalists in that linguistic group or that region jobs. They just may not exist. So what happens to those people in that group that want to be journalists? Well, they have to look elsewhere for economic opportunities. So where do they go? To the cities, where there are more people, where there are more opportunities, where the larger linguistic groups are. And so you get this urban versus rural divide, where in urban centers, journalistic professionalism is real high. In rural areas, it's extremely low. We definitely have not seen anything like this before. And our author very quickly starts arguing, once again, this variable in and of itself, the way it is defined here for these 17 democratic countries that the models are based on, does no service to talk about the media system in South Africa. Because language is such a big deal, because it reinforces urban versus rural divides, and neither of those are taken into consideration inside of our three models. Now we're on to the last of our four variables, role of the state. How high is state intervention in South Africa? And I think this quote from the author is pretty telling of what was going on in South Africa. Post-apartheid author states, at best, the ANC's relationship with the political press has been distant and neurotically suspicious, and at worst, pathologically hostile. What does that mean? Well, in short, that means not good. It means the government has been suspicious and hostile towards press in general. Well, how so? Well, the author gives us 7 ways that the state intervenes into press. I'm only going to go over 4 of them, okay? But our first one, legislation that tries to curtail media freedoms. How exactly is this state intervention? How exactly do we see this manifest in South Africa? And not just South Africa, but in many countries around the world. If you're a government and you want to limit what media can cover, you pass something maybe called the National Security Act, to where you can take a stamp and say, boom, national security. This topic cannot be reported on. And you start stamping a bunch of different things with it. And therefore you legally make it to where media have no access to information of what's going on in government. Another one is that we see lawsuits increasing in use. Once again, sadly, this is one of the big ones that we've seen across the globe in all kinds of regimes. The number of defamation suits that are going against journalists has been increasing in countries all across the globe. Now, how necessarily is this a form of censorship or state intervention? Well, in many places around the world, journalists don't make a whole lot of money. And generally speaking, the norm is that once a journalist is being accused of defamation, especially against the government, generally speaking, media corporations have to put them on suspended leave while those proceedings are taking place. Now, it doesn't matter if they're true or false. Well, for our story, the fact is that journalist is on suspended leave while that court case is going on. Well, if you don't make a whole lot of money, and these court cases in many countries can take a long time, you could be out of work, out of money, even though you may be innocent, for goodness knows how long. That's a real scary thing for many people in the working world. What are you supposed to do to make your money whenever you're a trained journalist? but you can't be a journalist. So there's a huge fear that all around the world, defamation cases are scare tactics to get journalists to self-censor. Because if they are put on suspended leave, even if they win the court case, it's not going to matter if they can't feed their families. Okay, once again, this is something that we haven't really talked about before. And our third one, 2005, the state launches a free magazine, free press. Why is this a big deal? Well, free is hard to compete with. How are you supposed to compete with a magazine that is free, printed in probably multiple languages, so it tries to get out to more and more people, whenever you, as a privately owned business or media, you have to charge people or you have to run ads in order to stay afloat? So this is government creating direct competition towards private media. This makes being a private media entity quite hard to do. And the last point I want to talk about real quick is the fact that, remember, 26 years now. It was only 1994 that the first black South African president started to lead the entire country, and the majority of people were still, or were free. This is a big deal whenever the government starts to make claims against different media outlets of being racist, and using that as a scare tactic to get people to no longer consume that medium or those media companies, news from those media companies, because they're being called racist by the party of Nelson Mandela, by the party of freedom, of independence. And there's been a lot of logged complaints against government using race as a charge in order to get media companies in trouble with their consumer bases. So all in all, you take just these 4 out of the 7 that are on the slide, and the author states, yes, role of the state in this case is high. And it is in the context of high state intervention is not good. It's not democratic. So he says this is one variable that does actually work out for a country like South Africa. So let's go ahead and put our 4 variables together and see what kind of model we have here in South Africa. So newspaper circulation rates, or media structure, low circulation. Political parallelism, high. Both of those look like the polarized pluralist. Professionalism tends to be low, but in urban centers it's high. So you could argue democratic corporatists, polarized pluralists, somewhere in the middle. And role of the state tends to be high, which puts it polarized pluralist. So when you look at the variable values, you see South Africa looks like the polarized pluralist model. But the author says no way, this is not the case. And he says the values that you look at in these variables, once again, tell you very little, if anything, about the media system in South Africa. He said these values don't tell you the reason why medias are the way that they are in South Africa. And of course, language and linguistics, ethnicity, race. These are all huge variables in South Africa that the models do not pick up on. So the author states, even though it looks like the polarized pluralist in a lot of ways, it totally is not. And then he brings up a really interesting suggestion about potentially making an African model. In place of trying to take these 3 Western European North American models, why not use South Africa as a case to create an African model that would be more generalizable to the 54 or 56 states that are in Africa? Now, I'm not going to go into this too much because I would rather us talk about this in the forum, for sure. But there is a big discussion to be had there. Can an African model exist, like the author is talking about? But let's also think about South Africa today. Let's update where the book left off. All right, so newspaper circulation rates still low. Press coverage, as far as political parallelism, still the same. Journalistic professionalism and role of the state, those are 2 that we want to talk about. So journalistic professionalism, I would argue, and Reporters Without Borders would argue as well, has gone up a lot. And role of the state has gone down a lot. If you look at Freedom House gives South Africa a 79 out of 100, which is free. 2018, it was a 78. That means it's been increasing in freedoms as a democratic country. Now granted, the ANC has still won every single presidency since 1994, so it's still one-party dominant democracy. Right? And what about Reporters Without Borders? What do they say as far as measuring media freedoms inside the country? South Africa is ranked 31 out of 180. That means it's in the top 30 almost for freest medias in the entire world. And it had the same ranking the year before in 2018. So what does that tell us? Although we had all those really horrible things that we talked about for state intervention, that even besides that, the press persists as a free institution. In so much that the press covered the former president Jacob Zuma's corruption scandal so much that he was forced out of office. Now, some people would argue that's more of internal ANC politics. But I think you have to give it up to media in South Africa being free enough and insulated enough from the influence of the ANC themselves to where they covered Jacob Zuma's corruption so much that the ANC had no choice but to put pressure on Jacob Zuma to resign from office. And his corruption scandal and his cases are going on today. So that is an exact idea of what watchdog journalism is. That's what media as a fourth estate are. So yeah, South Africa, 31 out of 180, doing really well. 79 out of 100 for Freedom House, almost 80 at the free ranking. But again, I want to bring us back to our question for the forum. Do we think an African model can exist? Let me know your thoughts. Why or why not in either direction.